Good afternoon. I think we have an excellent panel this afternoon. I'm interested to hear the discussion. So from my left, I'd like to introduce Chris Mitchell. Chris is the Director of Community Broadband Networks with the Institute of Self-Reliance. He is also probably one of the leading experts on community networks that I've come across in my time. Plus, he's also very well versed in internet access and how to achieve cost-effective internet access. Taking a look at his work, specifically if you have a chance to visit muninet.org, you'll find some excellent information, excellent data on how to go about building projects. So that's Chris. To the furthest right, Blair Levin. Blair is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, focused on Metropolitan Policy Project. He is also the individual that led the effort for Tom Wheeler at the FCC to develop the National Broadband Plan. So I think he brings some valuable information here. And in the center, we have our moderator, Phil Weiser. He is a Hatfield professor at the School of Law at the University of Colorado Boulder. He is also the founder of Silicon Flatirons, which is really pushing the boundary between policy, tax, and technology. So again, it's going to be a real interesting discussion, and I'm looking forward to. Gentlemen?
All right, we're thrilled to be here. It's going to be a fireside chat. We'll try to get some audience involvement as well, and we need to be done by 1:15 because Blair is literally catching a plane. Let me start with something that's near and dear to Blair's heart, which is gigabit networks. And the question is, where can we aspire to have gigabit networks, and where are they unachievable?
So first of all, I think it's important to understand where we were coming from. In 2009, when we started the National Broadband Plan, we had a cable network in about 92% of the homes with a kind of a high of 100 megs. We had but mostly was selling 20 to 50. And we had a telephone network, mostly copper DSL, selling between 5 and 15. But here was the most important thing. There were no plans for any future provider to build a network better than the cable network. And that was the first time that was true since the beginning of the internet. So the original importance of the gigabit networks was simply to get some action going on in terms of American bandwidth, so that we would not suddenly find ourselves when the Koreans and the Japanese and the Chinese and the Swedes and lots of other people were in a situation where bandwidth was not constraining economic growth and social progress, but that would be true for us. And so various things that came out of actually the national plan discussions, Google Fiber, the Gig.U project that I did, but also very much a lot of the stuff that Chris did with local governments. It's simply, when you do the next generation of upgrade, you're not going to put in copper. So now we have about 17% of the homes in America have access effectively to gigabit. That's actually a fair amount of progress. The economics are very different in different places. There are some rural areas where it makes an awful lot of sense. There are some urban places where it doesn't make sense, other urban places where it does. There's a lot of history, there's a lot of kind of market structure. We now see the next generation of mobile 5G, which is supposed to be a gigabit, supposed to deliver gigabit over mobile services. So I think the important thing for everyone in the audience to say is, look, at some point in time, we're going to just need a lot more bandwidth. You're not going to go from DSL to something slightly better than DSL. If you're putting in new networks, you're going to put in fiber, and you're going to want it to be gigabit capable. But it's very community to community specific. And I think we're still in a stage where we need to have a spirit of experimentation, both in terms of what the companies do, but also in terms of what the governments do.
I think the answer was, I don't know exactly how far gigabit can scale up, but it's a lot higher than 17%, so we'll see. Okay. Chris.
I'm sensitive to service providers that when they hear this discussion of gigabit, they roll their eyes, especially fixed wireless folks that are doing really good work in important areas. I think the talk of the gigabit, it comes about because it's a a standard. It's you buy interfaces and gigabit cards. So it's kind of it's an arbitrary number that resulted probably because of Google. But fundamentally, the goal that I feel like most of us are going for is where the network is not slowing us down. It's a network that operates like the electrical network in that I can go to Best Buy, buy a device, come home, plug it in. I know that it'll work. I don't worry that my electric utility won't be able to handle it. Like, it's just covered. And so that's kind of the world we're going for. I'm a
50 electric devices.
or 50 electric devices, yes, in fact, that basically that we know that the network will support our uses, and we're not waiting on the network. I constantly hear from people who say, oh, I'm fine with 10 megabits per second. And the experiment I'd like to do with people like that is give them 100 megabits for a week, and then take them back to 10, because I've done this with my parents every time I go to visit them. And I noticed a major difference. And I think people do notice that difference. You notice that you're waiting for things you weren't waiting for before. And that's it's a drag on innovation is what I fear. But fundamentally, one of the reasons I'm a proponent of gigabit is because I'm afraid of living in a world in which we have to bribe the service providers to get us to the next level. And when I hear about a community municipal network doing a project that isn't gigabit, I worry less than when I see a large cable or telephone company, a national company, doing that. Because I believe fundamentally that local providers, private or public, are more likely to invest at the right time to make sure that their networks are scaling with demand. Whereas when it comes to the larger providers, I think history shows us that they are reluctant for natural reasons relating to our market system to make those investments. So I think it's a really nuanced question. But I'm a firm supporter of reaching out there, and I've been educated in the benefits of fixed wireless and how fixating on the term a gigabit may miss some opportunities to get better networks today that are going to get us on that path of making sure we have the abundance we want.
So both of you implicitly acknowledge there will be some more remote areas that a gigabit is not necessarily feasible, or at least that's possible. You don't acknowledge that, okay?
I would just very briefly.
You'd say we'll have a gigabit to every home in the U.S.?
The question is time.
Okay. Within the next 5 years? Okay. Within the next...
Not sure ever.
So let's just keep... Within the next 5 years, we're not going to have a gigabit everywhere. Maybe the next 10 years?
On that order.
Okay. So for the next decade or so, we have this national policy challenge where we have a gigabit through the market, if you will, in already 20% of the U.S. We'll see where that number goes. But there's going to be some percent of homes that are not going to have it. They may have fixed wireless, maybe 5G, and we'll see how that does. What are the different policy levers for where you have and economists use different words here, but I'll call it a market failure or a public goods problem? What are the best levers to use to help drive the best broadband connectivity in those more remote areas?
Well, I fundamentally believe that rural areas are not as hard to connect as people assume. I think we'll probably get to this, but I think the greatest challenge we face in broadband are actually urban areas where you have different policy reasons. In rural areas, we figured out how to get an electrical line to every person in a time of incredible of desperation, in a time where we were fighting World War II and had incredible challenges with supplies and things like that. We did it with the right tool, which was rural electrification, electric co-ops. Electric co-ops are increasingly getting into this game. I think they're going to solve a tremendous amount of the rural challenge that we face. I think as we see more wireless gains, that will pick off some of that, and I think that in 10 years we'll be seeing wireless technology that can get close to that. It may not be 1,000 megabits a second, but it'll be abundance, I think. And the question in my mind is fundamentally just whether or not we want to do that, because the costs, Blair, your broadband plan called for $350 billion to connect with fiber every house in the nation, more or less. Now, if we accept that number, I think a lot of people thought it was too high. If we accept that number and we finance it using the mechanism we use for rural electrification, you're looking at a budget hit of a few $billions per year, because you can't do it all at once. We have supply constraints. So you have 10 years in which you spend $5 or $10 billion on loan guarantees. $5 billion of loan guarantees get you $50 billion of lending, roughly. So you can do this at a reasonable cost. The question is whether or not we prioritize it. And I would argue we've not prioritized it because we're convinced it's too expensive, because we've tried to use the wrong tool, which is operating cost subsidies to inefficient large telephone companies for the most part in rural areas.
So your main policy tool, if I caught that right, is the institutional framework of rural cooperatives backed with loan guarantees. Did I got that? For that'll solve most of the problem. Blair, where do you come down?
Agree in part, disagree in part. First of all, I think there are a couple of very important things that, and I think the co-ops are a tremendous path toward getting more broadband to rural America. I think later in the afternoon you'll hear from John Chambers, who's doing a lot of great work in that area, and I certainly think that that's something which people should very much focus on. The co-ops have assets, they've got in financial capacity, financial incentives, et cetera. So I certainly agree with that. Secondly, there's a point you're making that I think is really important about the way we fund it today, and we often create wrong incentives by giving operating subsidies, and I'm not opposed to that in every case, but in some cases I think we're making a mistake in doing that. Where I disagree is very much kind of in the most remote, and I think it's important to understand that there's going to be, roughly speaking, 0.5 to 2% of the United States where the economics just aren't going to work. When we did the National Broadband Plan study that Chris cited, that we saw that there were about 7 million homes that didn't have access to broadband by that definition. To fill the gap, we recommended, let's say order of magnitude $10 billion just for that gap. More than 50% of those funds went to 250,000 homes. So in other words, about 3% of the unconnected homes were more than 50% of the subsidy. And you get to a point where you're giving those homes more per year than the value of the home. I just think that politically that's a non-starter, particularly when you compare it to kind of satellite. So I think that there are two different things. But I should say, by the way, if we actually get an infrastructure bill, we can go a long way toward what Chris is talking about and really accelerate that. I'm skeptical that we will get an infrastructure bill, but certainly there are some very smart things that can be done. But I don't think, I think if we say, it's okay for politicians to say we're going to connect everybody, but within this room, I think we have to understand that there are some homes out there where the incremental cost is so high that politically it's just not really the right thing to do.
So we've started now this conversation about how do we drive gigabit fiber as far as possible, and we've now joined the question, where's wireless? And I'm going to mention 3 forms of wireless. Mobile wireless, which can actually obviously coexist with fiber because it will go on a line at some point. Fixed wireless, as well as satellite. How do those modalities play a role in the overall ecosystem? Blair, what's your theory of the case?
You'll find the theme Phil correctly summarized. One of my constant firm points, I'm not really sure. Because in fact, what we are actually doing in the United States today is building out a next generation network. We're building it out with fixed, and we're building it out with mobile, 5th generation wireless, where the architecture is fundamentally different from the first 4 generations. I think I'm somewhat skeptical from a Wall Street perspective, and I do some Wall Street work, that 5th generation will go as well as some people say.
What's the timing of 5th generation, and how do you define it?
Yeah.
So it's sort of these hype words. I'm not quite sure what people mean when they say it.
So 5th generation wireless, I think the right way to think about it is, to the consumer, it looks a lot like what you get out of Wi-Fi today. You have a wire going pretty deep into the network, and then a small cell radio serving maybe 10 times the amount that a Wi-Fi router would serve, but far fewer people than a big macro tower would serve. But it's gigabit capable, it has a lot less latency, it's very important for certain uses like vehicle to vehicle and Internet of Things and things like that. The people are talking about it in the 2021, 2022 time frame. From a market perspective, I would just note that cable is about to upgrade their networks to what's called DOCSIS 3.1. Well, they'll get a gigabit.
Down.
a big gigabit down, but not symmetric, is Chris's point. Though 300 up, which is not slow. And they've got a lot of Wi-Fi routers in places. It will not be as good as 5G, but it will be a lot cheaper, and they will get to the market earlier. And so from a market perspective, that's an important point. But I think that part of the problem that people are going to have is analyzing in a variety of different contexts, whether it be mergers or policy, is when do these networks start to compete with each other? Because when they do, there's a lot of things you can do differently in policy. And I might note we're going to spend a huge amount of time in Washington talking about so-called net neutrality. The big point that I would make is if you have gigabit networks, the dangers of net neutrality are a lot less. In other words, if you have scarce resources, the danger of blocking, throttling, or paid prioritization are significant. There actually are incentives to do that. But if you've got a 4-lane highway, a private person might come in and say, I can have an easy pass kind of solution, a private road. If you've got a 1,000-lane highway, I don't think there's going to be much of a market to have someone have a higher priority. And so, but we don't know yet. And we often in policy make the wrong judgment about what will happen.
So Blair, on the net neutrality debate, why wasn't there a proposal that said, if you build a gigabit network and people have full access to use it wherever they want, then you can do whatever you want above a gig, whatever the numbers are, whether it's 500 megs, or a gig, 500, whatever, figure out the numbers are. Why not say if you do that, then you can, do your private roads also, that's fine, prioritize, but then we don't care. Yeah. Why'd that never get any discussion?
Well, that actually, it did get some discussion among a small group of people back in 2010. Frankly, from my point of view, the net neutrality debate has emerged into something resembling the Sunni-Shia split, which actually comes out of something that happened about 1,300 years ago. And my point is, but people firmly believe what they believe, and they're not going to explore new ideas on this. But, fundamentally, that would, at least from my perspective, if somebody builds a gig, their incentives are totally different then.
So Chris, let's stick with net neutrality and let's come back to wireless.
One of the challenges and frustrations I have, and I know I share this with a lot of other people with net neutrality, is that I think it's important in that I'm afraid of living in a world in which we see the kind of prioritization and the middle messing around in the middle area where an ISP is making decisions for us. That's a world we don't want to live in. But when we win the net neutrality fight, we don't win anything. We win what we've had. And we're spending all this time on it when, in fact, I think many of us want to move to a world in which we're not just debating how to sort of keep the ISPs out of most of what we do, but how to actually get the ISPs totally out of our face in the way that the electric company is out of our face. And I'll just use that example again, because I think we're going to see this incredible explosion of applications still coming, right? I mean, we're not done with innovation yet. And as that's happening, there's a question as to who owns the network, whether or not they'll be able to mess with those applications, or whether or not you have to ask them permission to use it. Because this whole idea of the stack, of the IP stack, of how we get bits from place to place is changing with software-defined networks. And it worries me that we may see the ability of these big ISPs to still have this influence over applications that are being created. When you look at organizations like AM in Idaho, and they're working with a rural fiber provider, private company out there as well in Idaho that's doing this. They're figuring out how to build a network and enable people to create applications where the network owner cannot interfere. Where it's not just a matter of they decide not to interfere, but they're not able to interfere. And I think that's where we want to go for innovation, and that's just not coming up in this net neutrality discussion. But I don't say that to say we need to ignore net neutrality. We can't get to that next discussion without solving this and hopefully putting it behind us and being creative.
Can I make a quick observation? I worry less than you do about where we are today. I would just note there's a lot of discussion on Wall Street about the potential of Sprint merging with T-Mobile, about Comcast merging with Charter, about after those two deals, those two entities merging, AT&T is buying Time Warner Entertainment. You can see Verizon suddenly decide they need to buy CBS, Viacom, or Disney buys Verizon. That's when I start to worry more, because when you have diversified, vertically integrated companies, the incentives shift. And it's not so much on blocking applications, but on bundling and packaging in ways where people really have huge incentives to only watch certain kinds of things or do certain kinds of things.
There's a line that there's no one lobbying for the companies that have not been born yet. And I agree. I don't think we're going to live in a world in which Comcast is going to block Netflix. I don't think that's going to happen. What worries me is the next app that would be using an advanced technology is not able to do it on the network architectures that we have, and we may never know about that opportunity.
Do you worry more about that on broadband networks than, let's say, the App Store, Google, Android, or Apple? Or do you worry equally about both?
I can't imagine how I would stack up the amount of worry, but it is a concern. And I would say that we put into the plan that we would turn the tables on you. And whether you're talking about the App Store or the kind of mergers that Blair is discussing, which I, again, think we need to fight these mergers, but when we win, we have not won anything. We've treaded water for another day. So the question is antitrust dead, or do we have some hope here?
So I'm an optimist, so I always have hope. And I'm also now a political candidate for Attorney General in Colorado, so that definitely makes me an optimist, because I believe that we can get change through our political process, and we can have leaders who believe in antitrust enforcement at the state level, if not at the federal level. We don't know what the federal level under Trump is going to look like. This is a candidate who said he was opposed to the AT&T Time Warner merger. Now, I don't believe he had studied it before he'd made that judgment. He will have a DOJ study it, and they will make their judgment. That will be a sign about what level of enforcement we'll see. Also, mergers like
Can I just note, he appointed someone to run the DOJ antitrust division who said that deal presents no antitrust problem. So, you know.
Details.
Right. Not a strong suit.
So the question about antitrust is really important, because we in the antitrust world are in the aftermath of the Chicago School Revolution, which generally took a view of false negatives versus false positives. And what it did was put a thumb on the scale and said, if you make a mistake by bringing an antitrust case, you will distort the market. But if you don't bring it, the belief was, and Frank Easterbrook wrote this article called The Limits of Antitrust, that the market will take care of it. The problem with that Chicago school is it's not grounded in empirical reality. It is a powerful theoretical conjecture. It was a powerful critique of some questionable 1960s antitrust cases. But where we are now is looking to revitalize antitrust in a world that empirical reality underscores its virtues. So let me pick airlines for a minute, then go back to telecom. In the airline industry, which is now, I would say, overly concentrated, because when fuel costs went way down, did consumers get a break? No. They made a ton more money, and they gave consumers free peanuts. And so that is indicative of a market structure that's not working for consumers, a market structure where there were too many mergers that happened, not enough entry. So I believe antitrust still plays a role here on both fronts, on merger review and on ensuring that markets are open to entry. We need to be nervous when markets are not open to entry. So we still haven't gotten Chris talking about wireless yet, so maybe let's close that loop and then come back to the conversation.
So I'm extremely skeptical that mobile wireless will present an alternative to wireline networks. I'm not as into the economics of this as some of the people in this room, but I read a study from Vantage Point, actually, which made an argument that with these with the small cells, you get most of the cost of the wireline with not most of the capacity. And that's something that I worry about. To some extent, when I look at this, as someone who looks at this, I live in Minneapolis. I'm very skeptical of kind of the discussions that happen inside the Beltway. I'm trying to get a sense of what's really happening out in the world. And what I fear is that most of this discussion around 5G is not about what's best for people who want to subscribe to the internet and connect their devices. It's mostly about trying to scare investors from independent companies that are building fiber networks. A lot of the discussion, this is about as conspiracy-minded as I get, but you see all these articles suggesting that 5G is going to solve all our problems. And I like to say, I started this 10 years ago. It's my 10-year anniversary coming up with my organization, and had a lot of background in tech, but not a lot of background in telecom. When I came in, I sort of intuitively saw that fiber was this long-term investment. And people kept telling me, no, Wi-Fi is great. Wi-Fi is going to solve all of our problems. We don't need to do anything else. So that lasted a few years, and then it was, oh, well, Wi-Fi isn't quite what it was cracked up to be. WiMAX is going to solve everything. And so there's no need for fiber optics. We've got WiMAX on the horizon. WiMAX came and it went pretty quick, and that wasn't a big deal because 4G LTE was going to solve every problem, 100 megabit to every device. We were never going to have to invest in another thing. Obviously, this is a little bit of hyperbole, but there are people who are saying these things that were taken seriously by policymakers. Now I hear the same thing with 5G, and it just strikes me that fundamentally, we want to have good mobile connections, and we want to have good fixed connections. A lot of the discussion that I see claiming that mobile discussions will, a lot of the discussions I see claiming that mobile connections will be sufficient seems to come from those who are fearing competition from high-quality wireline or fixed wireless networks.
So, Blair, I think the conjecture and challenge that Chris said is 5G is the next version of broadband over power line. Agree or disagree?
Disagree, but A, there's absolutely a risk of that. And B, 5G is certainly in the hype curve. But I think the fundamental technology developments are much closer to reality than we ever had with broadband over power line.
So, I'm looking on Twitter to see if we were getting any questions here, but we're going to get them from the audience shortly. Let me ask you guys one or two more before we get to the audience. We've talked about policy strategies from a funding perspective, the co-op model with loan guarantees, universal service, but what about other policy levers? So access to rights of way or issues around dig once policies. Are those window dressing, or are those potentially real enablers that would make a difference? Blair?
I think there are a number of policies which local governments can adopt which have an order of magnitude somewhere between a 20 and 30% reduction in the cost of deployment, and that can be material. I am a little concerned that the FCC thinks that the fundamental problem in terms of deployment is that cities are somehow over-regulating. It's not about over-regulation, it's about various construction management. What we saw with Google Fiber and actually following up with AT&T and CenturyLink and the Gig.U project that I was working on was that cities are very excited about lowering the cost of deployment, but they are the monopolist manager of construction. And so you have, if you give people incentives to become more efficient, they'll become more efficient. And I've worked with over 100 cities. All of them would be willing to do certain things if they get something really great from it. And a fiber network is one thing, a 5G network is another. So these things are really valuable, but I think the notion of the FCC preempting cities is very problematic. And let me just raise one other thing with a few cities that I've been working with. Some cities want to use these policies to actually accelerate 5G deployment in low adoption areas, which I think can be a very important tool for bridging the digital divide. There was a study that came out of California showing that AT&T is not really building to certain areas their fiber network. I actually published something with someone else today in the San Francisco Chronicle saying we disagree with the study's critique, and particularly their recommendation in terms of policy. But the point they're raising is an important one. Market forces aren't going to drive deployment everywhere. And if cities want and communities want to use various tools to help accelerate and drive deployment to certain areas, I think we should let them experiment in the same way that we let private enterprise experiment.
Well, I strongly agree with the idea of experimenting. I feel like one of the challenges we have is local governments have not always stepped up. And in many cases, I think they're, I hope, about to, but they have not. And there's reasons that many have not. But that's what we need is local government engagement. I certainly don't think local governments have been a hindrance in most cases. There are a few horrifying examples that are trotted out regularly about bad permitting processes and things like that. Cities that have delayed wireless networks out of fear for cancer, for instance, which I think is just, it must be insanely frustrating to be a provider trying to work through that process. I get that. Most cities that I've worked with are desperately trying to figure out how to get more providers in. What they fear is what we're seeing with some of these mobility towers. If you follow me on Twitter, we've been retweeting some of these stories where people, they come home and they find 100, or I think in more cases a 50 or 60-foot tower outside their house on the sidewalk, with plans to have a 120-foot tower nearby, where local governments haven't had a chance to really vet those policies and to have an engagement to make sure that this is not going to destroy home values and present.
There are no zoning laws in those communities?
Well, this is complicated in a number of states where states have passed laws to preempt local authority. And in some cases, I think mobility has actually violated those zoning laws. And but to another extent, what I see from local governments is a concern as to how much power they will have in the future to be able to make sure that these things are not happening.
So, I mean, it's interesting your perspective on local government. I've heard, and maybe this is dated, there are still local governments who view telecom providers as a cash cow, and that when they want to come in, the local government says, here's our chance to get our chunk of change before we give them the green light.
I'm not gonna dispute that, because I've talked with some local governments who have that perspective. But I think when I did several interviews with Lincoln, Nebraska, who I think does this really right and is being looked up to by many other cities. Lincoln's perspective was, A, we want to be compensated, but our number one priority is to get these small cells out to the public, to enable investment from multiple wireless carriers to improve service. So that is their desire. They worked very proactively with Verizon, and they have an agreement. Boston has an agreement with Verizon that seems very reasonable. There are cities that are trying to figure out how to get every last dime out of it, and I don't think that that's good policy. And I actually don't know many people who think that's good policy when you weigh the pros and the cons in terms of how that retards investment. But I also see I see local governments that have to deal with states that are considering limiting their compensation to $20 a year or something like that, where you're looking at this incredibly valuable piece of local property, and basically the state is saying, you're going to give that to private business for them to profit on, and local taxpayers are not going to be compensated for their property. And I don't think that's appropriate, and frankly, I think that there's many groups that believe in property values that don't get involved in this sort of thing normally, that should be getting involved in those sorts of discussions.
Can I just add, when Verizon did its Fios rollout, 100% of the cities thought, great, we'll be able to tax them, and it'll be kind of a way of getting tax revenues without raising people's taxes. With Google Fiber, that started to change, and I would argue that providers have two choices. They can go to legislatures and pass these laws, which I think will backfire on them for a variety of reasons, or they can simply say, look, if that's your view, fine, we're just not going to build out there. Because they all have choices of where to build. And I think actually market forces, just as with Google Fiber, forced cities to think differently. And now, it used to be in 2011 and 12, I had lots of conversations with mayors on this very point. Pretty much every mayor I talk to now, they get it. The real value is in creating an economic infrastructure that will thrive in the 21st century global economy, thereby raising property values.
And I believe property values in Kansas City went up after Google Fiber in a notable way. And so that goes to your point. All right, last question for you two, then we'll get the audience involved. Name your top one or two local experiments that you're seeing happening, whether driven by a local body or maybe a state body or a tribe, what have you. Blair,
so let me just, before I get to that, I just want to you mentioned Dig Once. I never got around to it because polls are so interesting. The challenge with Dig Once is that you really need locally engaged leadership. I think it's really important. It can only really make a difference at the local level, county or municipal. You need elected officials to put pressure on public works if they're not willing to play ball. There's a lot of challenges involved. It's not just putting fiber in the ground. There's developing a plan to have a sense of where one places conduit and things like that. But this is something that we can do and will encourage both private and public investment in the future. So I think it's really important. States, the federal government, they can do it. I don't think it makes that big of a difference on the whole. I think, if we could do it around federal lands, that would be tremendously helpful. But on average, I don't know that we need to plow a whole bunch of fiber in 35 between Dallas and the Twin Cities in Minnesota. Now, regarding, I mentioned Ammon briefly, and I think it's worth coming back to. Frankly, I don't know if this will be the model of the future. I think it will be in some places, and we'll see whether or not the kind of innovation it can spur will catch on, and whether or not it'll sort of grow to a critical mass where it's replicated. But the excitement that we're seeing in Ammon, where you have residents that have access to DOCSIS 3, at least 3.0, possibly 3.1 cable service. You have 3 out of 4 people or 2 out of 3 people in these areas are volunteering to put their property on the hook for 20 years for a fiber network that they're going to have to repay. It's incredible to see this level of interest. So for people who aren't familiar, Ammon is basically building out a fiber network that's financed by homeowners. When they did that, I was concerned that we would see 20% of people take it, but we're seeing an incredible amount of people who have an okay choice. It's a cable company that has some unreliability issues, but there's incredible enthusiasm, and now Ammon is about to invite all kinds of other app makers to come in and to have access to people, to develop new apps that are all these concepts that most of us won't see for 5 or 10 years. It's worth.
So Ammon's located where?
It's in Idaho.
And who's their local providers there? They were just not getting it done, so they decided to create this new model?
Right. And it's interesting because it's a financially responsible approach that doesn't require a whole lot of borrowing or any necessarily. But the fundamental issue is that I think cities have been disrespected for how innovative they can be. Glasgow, Kentucky, if you go back and look at the history, they appear to be the first city in the entire country that had citywide broadband service in the early 90s. Cities can do incredible things with the right people, and I think that's something we don't always recognize. We've done a video on Ammon with Next Century Cities and the Institute for Local Self-Reliance that explains a lot of this better than I can in a few seconds. But I think it's incredibly inspiring, and it gives us a sense that the internet that our kids are going to be using may not look a lot like the internet we're used to using, and all our ideas about how to regulate and to encourage investment just to make sure we have a gigabit from a single provider might not get us to the world we want to live in.
Well, first of all, Chris is the foremost chronicler about all these things. So most of what I know about what local governments are doing comes from the website, so I highly recommend it. The one that I would point to that I'm actually working with is the state of Rhode Island, which put out an RFI in the fall basically saying, look, we know that we're going to need a 5G network, we're going to need a very robust Internet of Things network, and we're going to want a number of our enterprises to have access to be able to be big data enterprises. All of these things ride on fiber. What can we do holistically to look at all these problems from the state perspective, the city perspective, the nonprofit perspective, and of course the private sector perspective? We ran a workshop about 3 weeks ago on this. We'll be coming out with a series of recommendations in the summer. But I think looking at these things holistically and trying to see kind of in the Swiss cheese of networks, what pieces the government should do, what pieces the private sector is clearly going to do, what pieces really require public-private partnerships. And there are all kinds of things just about, for example, providing information that I think are really important. So I'd look at what Rhode Island is doing.
All right, we have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. I guess Jeff's going to grab a mic, or maybe Audrey's going to grab one as well.
He's talked
we'll
too much
share,
anyways.
and please just introduce yourself, and to get as many people in, let's try to keep them short. And I've got a few former students in the audience. I'm happy to call on them if no one else steps up.
Hi, I'm Brandon Dittmauer for Kissinger and Fellman. We represent local governments and broadband issues. Great presentation by everyone. Really enjoyed the points. Something I'm wondering, it seems right now that local government's really squeezed in trying to help accelerate deployment. On one hand, the FCC proceedings trying to limit what local governments can do to permit things. But the other end, some communities are trying to do really innovative stuff, touch once policies, dig once policies, but incumbents are suing cities over these types of policies. So I'm just really wondering, how is the local government supposed to navigate these challenges? It seems we're being squeezed on both sides, both from the federal government and from incumbents. We do stuff that can potential entrants tell us what to do.
So it's challenging. I've come around over the last several years to come into the belief that our number one failure is political will. It's not funding per se. Where funding's a problem, it's generally because of a lack of political will, in my experience. Which is not to say there are places that are struggling. It's just that I have seen communities that are really struggling find ways to make this work because they have not given up and walked away from the table. So local governments need encouragement from local businesses and residents to say, this is an issue. This is something that's been incredibly successful across Colorado. Colorado has more engagement from local government, and I believe from the business community. I mean, when I look at some of the stories I'm hearing of businesses demanding either the co-op or the existing or the local government do something, it makes me want to shout it out, and that's actually what we do to some extent on muninetworks.org to share it. But local governments have to navigate it by making it a priority. I've seen too many local governments that say, and often it's a single elected leader, a mayor, or someone that will say, there's nothing more important for our future than broadband. Our future economy depends on it, our education system, healthcare, everything depends on it. We're not going to put a dime into it. And that's a real challenge. Now, where you have private providers that are doing a good job, that might be appropriate. You might find other ways of doing it. But to some extent, we need to see local governments, and we have several here in Colorado who are doing this, stepping up and saying, hey, even if we can't build a network that is entirely financed by itself, we may subsidize part of it. That might be appropriate to make sure that some group of people has access that has not before. Fundamentally, I think elected officials don't understand how far ahead of them their constituents are. It varies widely by community. But I think we need elected officials that are willing to step out more and to push harder for these sorts of things.
I'm Matt Larson from VistaBeam. We do a lot of fixed wireless, also some fiber. I guess from a policy position, one of the things I'm a little bit concerned about is by establishing a gigabit standard, it's really locking in a certain modality because fixed wireless and a lot of the other technologies are going to have a hard time trying to meet up with a gigabit standard, looking at the existing stuff that we've got to work with. But maybe some more consideration should be given to the economic standard because fiber networks, wireline networks are very expensive to deploy. They have a much higher standard that they have to meet as far as penetration and acceptability amongst the customer base, whereas fixed wireless and a lot of these other alternatives don't have to meet that same economic hurdle in order to be financially viable. So I guess some of the concern I have is by using gigabit as your policy standard, you're creating the circumstances for a broadband bailout, just like we saw with the banks.
Where is the government creating gigabit as a policy standard?
What's that?
Where is the government creating gigabit as a policy standard?
You talked about in 2009, that's where the whole idea of gigabit, putting that out there, has become.
I understand that, but we actually, this is somewhat embarrassing. The National Broadband Plan used a standard of 4 down, 1 up, which was a considerable improvement over the previous one. What I was trying to communicate was not that the government set a standard of a gigabit, but that we had a problem in the market structure in which no one had an incentive to go to the next generation. It turns out that the next generation is fiber, and for a variety of reasons, it's a gigabit. The government has never set that. Indeed, industry laughed at that, and you could go back, there was a journal story, I remember, January 13, where all the incumbents were going, nobody needs a gig, no one will ever need a gig. And some of those very same people in the last few years have been crowing with great pride about how they're offering a gig. But that's a market-driven thing. It's not a government standard.
I wanted to use this opportunity to say something that I don't want to just sort of ignore, which is that I think this is a challenge that we have to deal with in which there are no good solutions necessarily. Now, Vista Beam is a great company, and I would love to see it succeed. Now, if Vista Beam was in an area where an electric co-op was doing fiber to the home, I think you would really struggle, and I think it's unfortunate. I think that we are going to see some good companies struggling as we see co-ops take over some of the space, and I wish that was not so. But it is honestly my preference that happens, rather than seeing a future in which we increasingly have high-quality connectivity, even from multiple choices in urban areas, and people that live in rural areas being left behind, because I do think that will be a disadvantage. Now, what I'd like to see is find ways that we can try not to have Vista Beam and companies like that run out of business, but I think that's kind of the trade-off that we have to deal with, and it's kind of ugly.
Well, just real. Go ahead.
To put a fine point on that, I think is what Matt is. I think, Blair, I guess the question was not directed at you, but I think Chris has taken this full on. If you saw a world where electric co-ops got subsidies to get to a gig that put out of business the Vista Beams doing 50 meg fixed wireless, 100 maybe, we'll see. The worst case scenario is the following. The 50 to 100 meg is actually good enough for most of the consumers. The subsidy program for the electric co-op puts out of business the good enough entrepreneur, and then the taxpayer-supported electric co-op gig, which we can argue whether it's necessary, ends up not working, and you get the worst of all worlds. Are you worried about that scenario?
I would be worried about that scenario as painted. I don't think it's particularly likely. First of all, many of the electric co-ops are not getting taxpayer dollars. They are funding this with loans that are at market rate or close to it. So it's worth noting that we are not seeing that, which I think is a loaded question when government gets involved. Because to some extent, if we see...
You had said loan guarantees, right? That had been...
Well, that was one way of making sure that we were to get there. Right. Right. So one of the challenges, I think, from my organization's point of view, we believe that when the federal government makes a decision for for a country as varied as ours, we get in trouble. I would like to see this sort of thing just devolve down, where you know that a state that knows its providers better can do something, even better, counties and local governments where they actually kind of know better what's going on. I mean, DOLA does a wonderful job in Colorado. Most states don't have a DOLA. So I don't know how to answer that question. But I think it is worth being very honest about this and saying, if we are going to basically make sure that no fixed wireless company that is doing a good job goes out of business, we may be leaving a lot of people worse off relative to their neighbors who live in urban areas or who live in electric service territory where they have done a gig. This is fundamentally why we're seeing electric companies get into it and why I think we'll see it cascade dramatically, because it's viral. If you live in a state in which for 100 miles you can't find anyone with good internet access, it sucks, but it's no big deal. If 25 miles away they have great internet access, people move. Like, that's what happens. I mean, these things, over a decade or more, you see tremendous change. So these are the things we're wrestling with.
Real quick, Chris. I was at a co-op meeting for an electric co-op about 3 weeks ago that was looking at doing fiber to the home. And we had a discussion with them, looked at the entire thing. And what happened was when they threw out the price of having to come up with $60 million to do this build out, almost universally, the people in the room were like, you know what? Our electric rates have gone up over and over and over. Why don't you figure out how to keep our electric rates the same or lower that and quit screwing around with broadband? So co-ops are not necessarily the perfect answer. There's a lot of financial manipulation that needs to be done for loan guarantees and government subsidies and all these things to try and prop up something that may not be economically sustainable. And the whole point of what I wanted to make was I think we need to be looking at economic sustainability as one of the key factors as we look at building out more advanced broadband networks.
I got a question. This is probably towards Phil or for Blair. I'm Tim Miles. I represent the school district up in Steamboat as well as the Northwest Colorado Broadband. So I've been successful from the school district building the network and as well as regionally around our area. The local government's doing it. It's not easy. We're doing it because we have a need, and that need isn't being served. It doesn't mean we're really good at it. We're just trying to get our need met. The underlying thing that I see from my experience doing this, is there's assets in the ground that are already there not being used, and it's a business decision on the company that controls those assets, but I'm building my assets either over them or beside them or across them. Do you think nationally or from a state level there will be policy changes that if those assets aren't being used either through eminent domain, through a utility, making a utility, that those assets can get opened up somehow, especially if they were put in years prior with public entity dollars, including USAC dollars? USAC, if they were put in with USAC dollars up until just last year, it's kind of public dollars, but that entity owns them forever and controls them forever.
All right, a fabulous last question to end on. Blair, you want to try that one first?
It is a great question, and it comes up in a lot of different contexts. Certainly when we were doing the National Broadband Plan, one of our starting positions on Chapter 6 infrastructure was let's explore all things which allow us to better utilize existing assets. So you come up with the dig once as a version of looking forward, using existing rights-of-way assets better. You come up with pole attachment strategies like make ready once kind of policies. All of those things I think are really good. Interestingly, with the recent debate on E-rate, you get a kind of interesting thing where the FCC said local governments should have the right, if they think they can do it cheaper, to do it themselves. The argument against that is from the incumbents who say we already have the assets. The argument against them is, well, if you have the assets, you ought to be able to do it cheaper. And so one of the challenges, and I'm an empiricist. I mean, I have my own political views, but at the end of the day, I see a lot of this about aligning leverage and incentives. And if you say to a city, you'll get the E-rate dollars, but the only person you can spend it on is the local telephone company, you're not going to get a great deal. If you say you can spend it by self-provisioning, you're likely to get a better deal from the government. And I mean, from the incumbent phone company. So I think there's a certain kind of balance where clearly from an economic perspective, it's always better to use that which is there to upgrade. But from a business perspective, you want to have some flexibility so you get a real negotiation and you can actually drive the price down to something closer resembling the real cost.
So, Tim, short version, the eminent domain of fiber in the ground play is a really hard one to pull off legally. A less hard one that would take some work, I've suggested it before, is a use it or lose it on spectrum, where if you have a spectrum license in those areas, and let's say it also includes some urban areas, and you just sit on your spectrum, you're not using your spectrum, there's more opportunity there. Recently, the FCC's tried to get at that through build-out requirements, that if you aren't building out in all areas or even leasing it, you lose it. It's much harder to do that with fiber in the ground, and the strategies that Blair mentioned thus become more important.
But do you think there's hope? As far as some policy may...
There's always hope, Tim.
Thank you.
And here's the thing. Don't underestimate shame as a strategy.
Oh, I know. Yeah,
right?
believe
Use
me.
it.
Yes.
Right. In Washington, they're shameless. But in Colorado, if you tell a provider, you've got fiber in the ground, I'm trying to get, gigabit, whatever, to my school, hospital, community center, come on, let's figure out how to use it. Hopefully the shame strategy works.
Yeah, I'm not running for office. Neither does the incumbent pay my paycheck. So believe me, my name's well known in the state.
So I just wanted to conclude, because I think that's what we're doing here, with a note about that. I feel like, and I've seen this in Colorado more than other states, there's a sense, and we see this in arguments in the State House, and we see it at the federal level, of, well, there's already some fiber in the ground to that community. And to which I would say, if it is not available on reasonable terms, it might as well not be there. I worry about strategies that would get involved in the legal system because, frankly, generally, we're talking about assets that are owned by companies that have lots of lawyers, and they would love for nothing more than to spend a lot of time in the courts making sure that nobody's actually taking their customers away. So in many ways, I actually disregard a lot of the infrastructure that's out there and already what I would call unavailable. Now, if you can find ways of working with existing providers, I think that's great, and I think it makes a lot of sense. What I fear is discussions that go in that direction but are never going to get anywhere. It's like an asymptotic discussion where you have lunch after lunch after lunch. So what I would say is, don't be afraid to recognize that you may need to build new fiber in an area that already has fiber. But when you do it right. Make sure that you have rights to it forever into the future. Make sure that you have plenty for expansion and leasing to multiple providers and that sort of thing. But don't necessarily just think that because it's there, it's useful. It might as well not be there in many cases.
All right, I want to thank our panel. It was a great discussion.